This is our third meeting on the subject of biblical holy days and their messages. And while I'd like to reiterate the point that I made both last week and the week before, that these holidays that are generally described as Jewish holidays are, of course, essentially biblical holy days, and I'd rather describe them as such because, after all, anyone who believes in God's word in the Bible inevitably is affected by these days and their messages. That, of course, was true 2 weeks ago when we discussed what the Torah calls the first day of the seventh month, and we identify as Rosh Hashanah. That was manifestly true in our discussion last week of the holy day the Torah identifies as Yom HaKippurim, what we generally translate as the Day of Atonement. And of course, it's also true of Sukkot. But it is so much more dramatically true of Sukkot than any of the other days, precisely because of the motif that I know all of you know very, very well that pertains to Sukkot and doesn't pertain to any of the other holy days that are mentioned in the Torah. What I am intimating here is Zechariah chapter 14. So please take out your Bibles and open Zechariah chapter 14. The subject of the prophecy is a terrifying one, and in its general thrust, it is very similar to the prophecy of Ezekiel in chapters 38 and 39 of Ezekiel. Ezekiel describes it as the battle of Gog and Magog. Zechariah doesn't identify the instigator by name, but of course both prophets speak of the final decisive battle against Jerusalem. In the beginning of the chapter, a day is coming to God when your spoil will be divided in your midst. Jerusalem is taken. I will assemble all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, and the houses plundered, and the women ravished, and half the city will go forth into exile, and the residue of the people will not be cut off from the city. Then will God go forth and fight against these nations as on the day when he fought on the day of battle. And his feet will stand on that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is east of Jerusalem. And the Mount of Olives will be split in two, in its middle eastward and westward, making a very great valley. A very vivid description of the cataclysm that shakes the earth. I might note Ezekiel also speaks of a massive earthquake. And likewise, Zechariah in the following verse, you will flee from the valley of my mountains, just as you fled before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, the king of Judah. Then will come God, Lord, and all the holy ones with him. And in the continuation, of course, the decisive conclusion of the battle, as we read in verse 9, God will be king over all the earth. On that day, God will be acknowledged one and his name one. And of course, there is a very vivid description of the implications of God's dominion being established, but the part that is, of course, most relevant to our discussion of this extraordinary holiday is what we read in verse 16. And it will come to pass that everyone who is left out of all the nations who will have come against Jerusalem will go up year by year to bow down before the King, the God of hosts, and to celebrate the feast of Sukkot, of tabernacles. So, of course, inevitably, we recognize that while all the holy days in the Torah are indeed Torah holy days, biblical holy days, not only days that have a message to Israel, but to everyone who believes in the sanctity of the Bible and reveres the Word of God. In the case of Sukkot, it's a whole different story. In the case of Sukkot, the significance of the holy day for the nations, for all the nations of the world, is explicit in the Bible. Now, of course, we grant this significance is not something to be discerned here and now. It is, after all, the world of the future after that final battle. But it is a critical motif in our understanding of this holy day. Now, of course, simultaneously, in our trying to understand what this means, on the face of it, we confront a glaring inconsistency. It seems like a contradiction, because, of course, when we read the description of this holy day explicitly in the Torah, in Leviticus chapter 23, from verse 33 to 43. There is a description of this holy day. The Torah explicitly identifies it as Chag HaSukkot, the same holy day to which reference was made explicitly in the words of the prophet Zechariah. What is glaringly incongruous is, after all, in Leviticus, the motifs of this holiday are explicitly motifs that pertain to Israel. So what is it then? Is it a day that is unique to the nation of Israel, or is it one that pertains to all the nations of the world? Again, reading in Leviticus chapter 23 from verse 33, God spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, on the 15th of this 7th month," that is the date here, "will be the feast of Sukkot, of tabernacles, for 7 days unto God. On the first day will be a holy convocation, and no productive work is to be done." And in the continuation of the description of the day, we read in verse 39, "On the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the fruit of the land," the festival of ingathering, which is the way the festival is identified in Exodus as well. The first reference to it being in Exodus chapter 23, verse 16, as the ingathering festival. So, when you ingather the fruit of the land, you will keep the feast of God 7 days. On the first day will be a rest. On the 8th day will be a rest. And then there is the description of the taking of the 4 species. The Torah does not explicitly identify what the message of the 4 species is, except in telling us that when we take these 4 species, we are to rejoice before God our Lord 7 days. That, of course, in verse 40. And the continuation, the aspect of this holiday that, of course, gives it its name. In verse 42, in Sukkot, in booths, you will dwell 7 days. All members of Israel, all the citizens of Israel, will dwell in booths in Sukkot. And here's where we get to the important point that clearly raises a major question with respect to the message in Zechariah. What's the point of the booths? The Torah does tell us explicitly, in order that your generations may know that I caused the people of Israel to dwell in booths, tabernacles, Sukkot, the Hebrew Sukkot, when I brought them forth out of the land of Egypt. I am God your Lord. And of course, here's where the problem is fairly self-evident. That is, if the message of Chag HaSukkot, the way the holiday is identified both in Leviticus and in Zechariah, is, as explicitly stated in Leviticus, so your generations will know that I caused the people of Israel to dwell in booths when I brought them forth out of the land of Egypt, then what relevance does this holiday have to all the nations of the world, such that all of them are enjoined to ascend to Jerusalem and keep this holiday of Sukkot in the world of the future after that final battle against Jerusalem has been fought and won by God? That's the obvious question. And inevitably, it points us toward trying to understand what the booths are for altogether. And obviously, by extension, what this holiday is for altogether and what its message is to us, that is, to all of us, to the nation of Israel and to the nations of the world. So first, some basic definitions. What is a sukkah? We have variously rendered it thus far as booth, as tabernacle, or just leave it in the Hebrew, sukkah. But what does it mean? There are a number of verses that we could cite here to get a good working definition. I'd like to point you toward Isaiah chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. Here, Isaiah is describing the perfected world of the future in a different vein, in a different context. And he states, again, chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, then God will create upon every dwelling of Mount Zion and upon her places of assembly a cloud and smoke by day, and the brightness of a flaming fire by night. For over all the glory shall be a covering. The covering here is the Hebrew chuppah, a fairly familiar word that is also used to describe the wedding canopy. The next verse states, and a sukkah, that's the Hebrew, a sukkah shall it be, for a shade in the daytime from the heat, and for a refuge and for a covert from tempest and from rain. In other words, a sukkah is something that protects you from the elements. That's the simple meaning of what a sukkah is. Something that affords you a measure of protection. Why do I say a measure of protection? Because obviously, it's not a house. A house with not only solid walls, but also a solid roof provides you with the best protection. A sukkah doesn't do that. A sukkah is, to employ the Hebrew, lisakech, to shield. To shield on a minimal plane to, on the one hand, make you conscious of what you are being shielded from. Because, unlike a house, you are still exposed. And while a sukkah, in order to fulfill the requirement for holiday use, has to provide majority shade, only a minority of sunlight, there's still the sunlight there. It provides you with some protection, but only as a shield. You are aware of what you're being shielded from, and yet simultaneously you are being shielded. Not being out in the open on the one hand, and not being inside a house on the other hand. As for what this implies with respect to God's statement, back in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 43, so your generations will know that I caused the people of Israel to dwell in Sukkot, in booths. What does that mean in practice? In our tradition, there is indeed more than one answer. Whether it refers to ordinary physical booths, the Sukkot that are similar to our Sukkot, in which our ancestors dwelt during the 40 years of sojourning in the wilderness. They didn't have real homes because they were wandering on the way to the promised land. They dwelled in Sukkot. That's one possibility. The other possibility is more sublime, and I call your attention again to the description of the covering that we just saw in Isaiah, speaking of a cloud and smoke by day. The idea that we have in our tradition of God having enveloped the nation of Israel in clouds of glory for their protection in the wilderness. So whether we're speaking of ordinary physical booths or these clouds of glory, clearly the message is you're being shielded by God. Because of course, the most critical message here is not that you were dwelling in booths, but that I caused you, says God, to dwell in booths. I protected the people in Sukkot as they emerged from Egypt on the way to the Promised Land. And to that extent, then, the Sukkah becomes a physical symbol of divine protection, of divine providence, of God watching over us. Of course, appreciating that point immediately connects in our minds with the timing of this holiday. Again, the way this holiday is first introduced in the Torah, in Exodus chapter 23, verse 16, is as the ingathering festival. A holiday of ingathering at year's end. You might note, we discussed this verse 2 weeks ago in our discussion of Rosh Hashanah, but more on that later on. A holiday of ingathering at the year's end when you gather in what you made from the fields. And again, of course, as we noted, the simple reference here is that in a Mediterranean climate, such as we have here. There is no rain during the summer, and the crops, after harvesting them, that's Shavuot, the Festival of Weeks, were left out in the fields to dry in the hot summer sun. And before the rains would begin after Sukkot in the fall, the ingathering festival to bring the crops inside. And of course, inevitably, we recognize why it's so important to be remembering divine providence, to recall how God took care of us in the wilderness at the time of ingathering. I think this is almost what we could describe as a no-brainer because it's kind of self-evident. If you take a look in Deuteronomy chapter 8, in Deuteronomy chapter 8, first note that in verses 2, 3, and 4, Scripture explicitly reminds us of the journey through the wilderness. You will remember all the way that God, your Lord, led you these 40 years in the wilderness in order to afflict you and to reprove you, to know what is in your heart, whether you would keep His commandments or not. And He afflicted you and gave you hunger and gave you manna to eat, which you had not known and which your fathers had not known, in order that He might make you know that not by bread alone does a man live, but by everything that goes forth from the mouth of God does man live. Your garment did not fall worn out from you, and your foot did not swell these 40 years. 40 years of journeying in the wilderness, continuously, intimately bonded to God's providence. Scripture here emphasizes the aspect of food, the manna, clothing, that your clothes did not become worn out. Scripture may indeed be intimating, perhaps also in verse 5, if we spoke so far about food and clothing, there is shelter. That is, in verse 5, you will consider in your heart that as a man chastens his son, so God your Lord chastens you. But whether shelter is explicitly stated in these verses or not, we certainly get the sense. This was intended to be an object lesson in feeling God's presence in your life. And it's a lesson that you need to take with you wherever you go from now on. Continue in Deuteronomy chapter 8 with verse 11. Take heed to yourself that you do not forget God the Lord, so as not to keep His commandments and His ordinances and His statutes, which I commanded you this day, that when you will have eaten and be satisfied, and will have built good houses and dwelt in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold are multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, that your heart then not be lifted up, so that you forget God your Lord, who brought you forth from the land of Egypt, from the house of slavery. And the particular emphasis here, the warning is, lest, in verse 17, you say in your heart, my power and the strength of my hand have gotten me this great host, this wealth. And therefore the emphasis, in verse 18, you shall remember God your Lord, for he has given you power to get wealth in order that he might fulfill his covenant, which he has sworn to your fathers, as it is this day. That is, the message, of course, isn't that it had nothing to do with your power. Just recognize where that power originates. That power itself was, after all, given to you by God. So, especially at the time of ingathering, when you have all this wealth, all the produce of the previous year, finally, at long last, after having toiled over it for the entire growing season, after having watched over it with such care and concern during the summer months as the produce was drying in the field, you've finally gotten to the point where you're bringing in the sheaves, the ingathering festival. That is, if anything, the point in the year in which materially you are least vulnerable, and as a result, spiritually you are most vulnerable. Because when you think that materially you are invulnerable, you are most liable to forget that it is God who gave you the power to amass that wealth. And so, it is specifically at the time of the ingathering festival that the Torah commands us to make the Sukkot, to dwell outside without the protection of a home, without a roof over our heads, just the thatching of the Sukkah, to on the one hand be conscious of the elements outside, and on the other hand to be conscious of there being a shield. But the shield is a tenuous one. Recognize how tenuous altogether your being shielded from potential disaster is. God is taking care of you. At the time of the ingathering festival, we rehearse in our minds everything that has taken place since the 40-year sojourn in the wilderness, in order to drive home in the strongest of terms that appreciation, that sensitivity, that awareness that it is God's providence and God's providence alone that sustains us. Not because we're going to sit back and do nothing. On the contrary, we worked. We toiled the whole growing season in order to produce those crops. But we recognize that the very ability to toil, that power to amass that wealth, was a gift from God. Everything ultimately is a gift from God. So, getting back to our opening question. Remember, the question was, if the message of Sukkot is God's causing Israel to dwell in Sukkot on the way from Egypt to the Promised Land, then why should this be a holiday that becomes explicitly a holiday for the nations of the world in the perfected world of the future? After all, that protection was something that was given to Israel. Of what relevance is it to the nations of the world? And of course, inevitably, we can discern answer number one here. Answer number one is that message of divine providence as the antidote to hubris, pride, arrogance, thinking that we can do everything on our own and we don't need God. Is that message something that only Israel needs to learn? Isn't that a message that everyone needs to learn? And especially the nations of the world after that final battle against Jerusalem, that if anything is animated more than anything else by that misguided sense that we can do whatever we want. We're in control. Sukkot teaches us we're not in control. Sukkot again teaches us that the control ultimately is God's, and it is specifically through learning the lesson of divine providence that we are able to appropriately appreciate what it is that God is demanding of us in this world. Because He demands us do. He tells us. He charges us. He gives us a mission. But ultimately, of course, we recognize our very ability to discharge that mission is in itself the power that is a gift from God. So, of course, again, on that plane, we have what I'll count here as answer number one. Why the holiday of Sukkot is indeed not just a holiday to Israel. And in the world of the future, it is a holiday to all nations. That's answer number one. But we have additional dimensions that I think necessarily must be invoked here if we're to really appreciate what the prophet is telling us and what the Torah is telling us. And so, on that note, we continue to answer number two. Numbers, chapter 29, from verse 12 and on. Verse 12 through verse 34. Well, we're not going to actually read all of those verses inside. I will merely call your attention to a fascinating numerical progression that we find here. Numbers chapter 29 presents in great detail the offerings that are to be brought in the Holy Temple on the holy days. We don't have a Holy Temple today. We don't have the wherewithal to bring offerings upon the altar. But again, the messages still endure. And what is particularly noteworthy, beginning in Numbers chapter 29, verse 12, is what the Torah tells us regarding the offerings to be brought on the holiday of Sukkot. If you look at verse 13, the initial description of the offerings brought on the first day of Sukkot, the holiday that is identified in verse 12 as the 15th day of the 7th month, and we already know, of course, from Leviticus chapter 23, that that is none other than the holiday of Sukkot. 13 bulls are to be brought upon the altar on the first day. Skip to verse 17. On the second day, 12 bulls. Skip to verse 20. On the third day, 11 bulls. Skip to verse 23. On the fourth day, 10 bulls. Skip to verse 26. On the fifth day, 9 bulls. Skip to verse 29. On the sixth day, 8 bulls. And finally, verse 32, on the seventh day, 7 bulls. There is, of course, the eighth day, but the eighth day is, as they say, another story. We won't get into the eighth day right now. Just consider, however, the progression over the 7 days. Remember, dwelling in the Sukkah is not through the eighth day. The Torah explicitly spoke of dwelling in the Sukkah for 7 days. This is, again, Leviticus chapter 23, verse 42. To dwell in Sukkot for 7 days. On those 7 days, brought upon the altar were: first day, again, 13 bulls. Second, 12. Third, 11. Fourth, 10. Fifth, 9. Sixth, 8. Seventh, 7. Add them all together. 7 plus 8 plus 9 plus 10 plus 11 plus 12 plus 13 equals 70. You can check me. It works. Of course, as undoubtedly you all know, in reckoning the offspring of Noah and the nations that emerged from his progeny, we have the 70 archetypal nations of the world. Of course, we recognize that nowadays, at least if we count members of the UN, there are a lot more than 70 nations. But the primaries, the essential basis of all the nations of the world, the number 70. Is it a coincidence that 70 bulls are brought upon the altar over the course of the Sukkot holiday? Well, the Torah doesn't tell us, but in our tradition, the answer is decidedly no. In our tradition, these 70 bulls brought upon the altar correspond to the nations of the world. And indeed, in this regard, we have a principle that when the temple is standing, the altar upon which the 70 bulls are brought serves as an atonement for the nations of the world. If I may share with you in this regard a statement in our tradition specifically regarding this and citing Psalms 109, verse 4. Israel is described as bringing an atonement on behalf of the nations of the world. The 70 bulls corresponding to them so that they will not be subjected to a fate of desolation in the world. That's the mission of Israel when the temple is standing on behalf of the nations of the world, to provide that atonement for the world. And it is in this vein that the verse that I mentioned earlier in Psalm 109, verse 4, is cited, that in recompense for my love, they are my accusers, while I have nothing but prayer. That Israel is described as bemoaning its fate, the atonement on behalf of the nations being tragically, manifestly unappreciated. That is, unappreciated by some people. I have to note that apropos of this same tradition of the 70 bulls corresponding to the 70 nations of the world, there is an interesting comment that in our tradition is associated with the second verse in Lamentations. Now, the second verse in Lamentations begins in Hebrew with the words Bacho Tivke Balayla, which undoubtedly in your translations is rendered as she, Zion, is crying in the night. But there is an interesting anomaly in the Hebrew. Bacho Tivke. It is a construction that is unique to biblical Hebrew, a double conjugation. It appears in a number of instances in the Bible, and inevitably it raises the question, why the double conjugation? There are a number of proposed answers for this anomalous doubling of the verb. One of them in our tradition is that it's not just Zion who is weeping, it's the nations of the world weeping with her. Because by consequence of the destruction, not only was Israel left bereft of its temple, but the nations as well were left bereft of the atonement that the temple and the altar provided. So of course, if you ask, well, who destroyed the temple? Inevitably we recognize we always have to be careful to not paint everyone with the same brush. There were nations who were destroying, but there were also individuals who were weeping. And again, that weeping and appreciation of the particular emphasis on Sukkot, 70 bulls corresponding not just to Israel, to all the nations of the world. Of what relevance is this, then, to our central question, which is, again, what does Sukkot have to do with all the nations of the world? You might say, I'm just begging the question by providing you with additional tantalizing association of the 70 bulls. But I think we can appreciate that what is taking place here, on the one hand, is of course a natural extension of what we already observed. That is, if the principal lesson to be learned by Sukkot is a lesson about divine providence, then of course we recognize that that lesson should not pertain only to Israel. It should pertain to all the nations of the world. And the 70 bulls corresponding to the nations of the world, if anything, drive home that very point. So the nations of the world, at least prior to the perfected world of the future, aren't themselves building the Sukkot, the temporary dwellings that accentuate that message of divine providence. Fine, so since they're not doing it themselves, Israel, as it were, is charged with doing something on their behalf, to bring the offerings that in essence are there to transmit the same lesson, that it all depends upon divine providence, that it is the atonement of these offerings upon the altar that ensures, as it were, that the world will not be consigned to a fate of desolation. But there's an additional dimension that I think we should also appreciate. And it is inevitably a dimension that also is inherent in the Sukkah. This is an observation that many of the commentators note with respect to what makes this mitzvah so extraordinary. Namely, we have, after all, a whole gamut of mitzvot, of commandments, with which the Torah charges us. After all, according to our tradition, the Torah comprises 613 commandments. What is unique about the Sukkah is it's not something you do, it's something you enter. It's something that envelops you. With every fiber of your being, you fulfill this mitzvah, not with some part of yourself, with all of yourself. You bring your entire self and all of your selfhood into the Sukkah. So of course, to that extent, we can readily appreciate that the message has got to be, we're not just going to bring ourselves in, we bring in everybody, everything. It's all about recognizing that Sukkah envelops it all. And indeed, in that vein, we appreciate likewise that in stressing the message of divine providence that the Sukkah is all about. The message of the Sukkah to us and the world is the revelation of God's kingdom to the world. And to that end, of course, inevitably we recognize it can't possibly be only about Israel. It's about all the nations. And so all the nations are going to be ushered into the Sukkah in this regard. I might note, and indeed a number of the rabbis note this point, that in our prayers, we have daily prayers on the Sukkot holiday that accompany our taking hold of the four species: the palm branch, the citron, the myrtle, and the willow. You know how the prayers that are attendant to our taking the four species end? They end with the verses in Kings 1, chapter 8, 59 and 60, from the end of King Solomon's words of blessing of the people after his very long and involved prayer that, as we discussed in other contexts, includes explicitly petitioning God to hear the prayers of the stranger who is not from among Israel. But at the end of the prayer, King Solomon beseeches God, "May these, my words wherewith I have made supplication before God, be near to God our Lord day and night, to maintain the cause of his servant and the cause of his people Israel in their daily requirements." But it's not just about Israel. Next verse, "in order that all the nations of the earth may know that God is the Lord, and none else." That message to all the world is a message that goes forth from the Sukkah. And again, to that extent, it is, on the one hand, a message that starts in the path taken by Israel through the wilderness from Egypt to the Promised Land. But it's all about the message of divine providence ultimately being integrated. So it will pertain to all the nations, to the entire world. That I'll take as my second answer to the question. That is, how Leviticus chapter 23, on the one hand, can tell us that Sukkot is about the history of Israel, and simultaneously we read in the last chapter of Zechariah that Sukkot is something that ultimately pertains to the entire world. Our first answer was that general message of divine providence, appreciating God's gifts, appreciating our dependence upon God. The second message was the appreciation of how everything ultimately needs to be brought to God in the Sukkah, the offerings upon the altar, and again in this vein, the role of the nations of the world. There is, however, one final dimension that I feel obliged to share with you. And I have to admit, it pertains to a different Sukkah. I could pose this to you as a riddle, but I have to admit that I also have a little bit of an advantage here in making my association with this other Sukkah. Because for us, it was a prophecy that we read just over a week ago on Yom HaKippurim, on the Day of Atonement, in the afternoon service, the prophecy of Yonah. Now, everyone, I'm sure, is well acquainted with the prophecy of Yonah. I certainly don't need to belabor this point for you because you know exactly what I'm talking about. The story of Yonah, the prophet who comes to Nineveh and preaches even briefly about repentance, and the whole nation repents. And of course, to that extent, the apparent central message of Yonah is a message of repentance, of real that the book isn't closed, the game isn't over, and we have the wherewithal to clean up our act and return to God. But you know, if that were really the whole story, that was the message of the book of Yonah, then I think we have a very obvious problem. What problem? The problem, in short, is chapter 4. Who needs it? The last verse of chapter 3 tells us, and God saw their works, that is the works of the people of Nineveh, that they had turned from their evil way, and God reconsidered the evil that he had spoken that he would do to them, and he did it not. They repented, and the decree of destruction against Nineveh was rescinded. And we can just imagine the end. Isn't that the end of the story? Of course, inevitably, evidently, the answer is no, because there's a fourth chapter. What is that fourth chapter coming to tell us? Well, it begins with Yonah having a problem. That Yonah was displeased exceedingly because he felt God had let off these sinners too easily. That is, as he expresses it, that was precisely the reason that he had attempted to flee from the divine mission in the first place. Therefore, I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God and a merciful, long-suffering, and abundant in kindness. And as a result, you reconsider the evil decree and you let them off the hook. And Yonah is so upset about this that he petitions God to kill him. This is what he states in verse 3. It is better for me to die than to live. Whereupon God's words to Yonah, is it appropriate that you are so wroth? And what then follows is the Sukkah in verse 5. That Yonah went outside of the city and he made himself there a sukkah and sat under it in the shade until he would see what would become of the city. And then there's the story, the very strange story of the gourd. That God made ready a gourd, and it's after all a vine. It grew up over Yonah to be a shade over his head to relieve him from his affliction. And the very next day, God made ready a worm. When the morning dawned the next day, and it smote the gourd and it withered. And when the sun arose, God made ready a hot east wind, and the sun beat upon the head of Yonah, and he became faint. Ironically, with the self-same expression that he used over God letting off the evildoers so easily. He again wishes to die. It is better for me to die than to live. And God asks Yonah the exact same question that he asked him earlier. Is it appropriate that you are so overwrought, so wroth, so upset, this time over the gourd? And Yonah doesn't get the message. He says, I am so wroth over it, even to the point of death. Whereupon God responds. And these are the last two verses of the prophecy of Yonah. God said, you would spare the gourd for which you had not labored, neither made it grow. It came up in one night and perished in one night. And shall I not spare Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 12 times 10,000 people who do not know their right hand from their left hand, and also much cattle? What a way for a book to end. Much cattle? Those are the last words of the book of Yonah? Much cattle? That's it? What in the world is this last chapter coming to tell us? Perhaps, very simply, at the beginning of the chapter, Yonah has a profound theological problem. Why is God letting Nineveh off so easily? At the end of the chapter, God bids Yonah to appreciate. Theology is all well and good, but God is also the Father of us all. The Father of all of humanity, even the Father of much cattle. Now, I know what you may be considering here is, wait a second, what about what God sends Moses to tell Pharaoh? Remember back in Exodus, in chapter 4, verse 22, when God charges Moses to say to Pharaoh, so says God, my firstborn son is Israel. But of course, inevitably, that's precisely the point. Firstborn, not only child. Since when do you ever call an only child a firstborn child? He's an only child. He's an only child. Firstborn means there are others. Who are the others? Of course, inevitably, the answer is the whole world. Firstborn, because Israel is charged with the role of opening the womb of humanity to God. Yonah evidently failed to appreciate that point. And so it was specifically in the Sukkah that God teaches him. That God tells Yonah, it's about my being the compassionate Father of all of them. Myriads of people in the city who don't know their right hand from their left hand. They don't understand anything. It's not because they're wise. It's not because they're righteous. In fact, it's not really because they are anything at all in particular. They are creatures, meaning they were created by me. Just like the much cattle. Cattle! Not even people! God is the Father of everyone and everything. All humanity, even the cattle. Everything that is a creature has a creator. The final message of Yonah is that we are, after all of us, then, God's children. And even the cattle are God's children. Everything is God's children. Once we appreciate that everything is God's children, of course, inevitably we recognize what the real deepest message of Sukkot is to us all as God's children. I need to remind you of something that we discussed 2 weeks ago. If you're in our discussion at the time, I'm sure you recall the major question that we were addressing was, we refer as Jews to the holiday that the Torah identifies as first day of 7th month as Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the year. Well, who says it's the beginning of a year? Since when is the 7th month the beginning of a year? I remind you that we did find explicit indication in Scripture that a year begins this month. You remember what the explicit indication was? We actually already noted that verse earlier this evening. Please return once again to Exodus chapter 23, verse 16. The ingathering holiday, the ingathering festival at year's end, when you gather in what you have made from the field. And of course, we discussed at great length the implications of referring to a new year, ironically, specifically, by speaking about how a year is ending, not beginning. We recognize that when we get to the end of a year, we don't fall off the edge. A new year begins. But why does the Torah describe the new year here as one that is ending? Well, of course, this is a much longer discussion, and we already had that discussion 2 weeks ago. I'm just going to remind you of the conclusion. The conclusion is, this is a new year that directs our gaze not forward, but backward. Introspection, taking stock, making an assessment. Where have we come from way back there? In some sense, taking stock is something that we associate not only with ourselves, but as it were with God. Taking stock means the entire world. It isn't only about Israel. Israel, again, is cast in the role of guide, to be the light of the nations, by whose light they go. But they need to go. They all need to go. It's not just Israel. And so inevitably we recognize that, of course, the lessons, the messages of Sukkot are first, initially, as the Torah expressed it in Leviticus chapter 23, verses 42 and 43, messages for Israel. But they're not just for Israel. The goal is to reach the whole world. The goal is to integrate those messages into all of humanity. As the prophet Zephaniah expresses it, this really is the goal. In chapter 3, verse 9, then I will change for all peoples to clear language, call all of them in the name of God, and to serve Him together as one, standing shoulder to shoulder. The goal has not been reached if that isn't the culmination of all of our efforts. And of course, I can't help but add here, you know this, this is a very personal point for me as well. I am fully cognizant, as I realize all of you are, of the wondrous signs of God's hand in what is taking place in the world around us today. To me, the most dramatic evidence of God's hand doing wonders is what's taking place right now between us. Because in our coming together to learn God's Word? Are we not, at the very least, initiating the fulfillment of Tzefania's words? Shoulder to shoulder. A virtual shoulder to shoulder, after all. We're not actually in one room, but we're in a virtual room together. That's almost just as good. And here we are, serving God together, integrating into our lives the message of this biblical holy day of Sukkot. It starts out with Israel. Of course it starts out with Israel. That's only the firstborn, not the only child. It's not about Israel. It's about the world. It's about a transformation of the world. And it is then on that note that I'd like to conclude. Just a couple of concluding thoughts in this vein with a couple more Sukkot. Psalms chapter 76 describes Zion, it describes Jerusalem, describes God making himself known in the holy city. And inevitably, not at all incidentally, again, Psalm chapter 76. In Judah, God has been made known. In Israel, his name is great. And in Shalem, Shalem is Jerusalem, was his Sukkah made, and his dwelling place in Zion. His Sukkah. Why is it that when, as we read in the following verses in Psalm 76, after the enemy is vanquished, and when God's name is great, it's specifically described as a Sukkah? Because after all, that's what it's all about. It's the Sukkah through which God's name is great, not only in Judah, not only in Israel, but in the world. And of course, not at all surprising, in the same vein, if you look at the prophecy of Amos, Amos chapter 9, verse 11, the prophet's vision of the divine deliverance, right near the end verses, which are dramatic words of consolation, says the prophet, on that day I will raise up the Sukkah of David, which is fallen. I will close up its breaches, and its ruins I will raise up, and I will rebuild it as in the days of old. And it's specifically a Sukkah. Not a house, a Sukkah. Because after all, it is specifically the Sukkah that signifies getting that message out. That is, after all, the essence of God's redeeming not only the Sukkah of David, but ultimately the whole world. And that brings me to the verses with which I'd really like to conclude. Maybe I'll just put in another verse afterwards. But if you look at Haggai, the prophecy of Haggai, specifically in chapter 2, verses 6 through 9. Now remember that Haggai was one of the prophets of the return to Zion, the second temple period. And indeed, he speaks of the ultimate deliverance, the ultimate rebuilding in the dramatic words of his prophecy. Thus has said the God of hosts, yet one thing more will I do. It is but little, when I will cause to quake the heavens and the earth. Perhaps the same earthquake to which Zechariah referred in chapter 14, and to which Ezekiel refers in chapter 38. Quake the heavens, the earth, the sea, the dry land, and I will cause to quake all the nations. And the precious things of all the nations will come here to Jerusalem. And I will fill this house, the holy temple, with glory, says the God of hosts. Mine is the silver and mine is the gold, said the God of hosts. Greater will be the glory of this last house than that of the first house, says the God of hosts. And in this place I will give peace, said the God of hosts. The vision of the rebuilt holy temple, of rebuilt Jerusalem. You might be wondering, all well and good, but what does this do with Sukkot? Well, if you look at the opening verse of chapter 2, when was this prophecy? In the 7th month, on the 21st day of the month. The 21st day of the 7th month is the 7th and final day of Sukkot. This is the culmination of Sukkot. This is where everything leads. Indeed, bringing in the sheaves. All the sheaves. It's not just our ingathering. God is ingathering us all, bringing us all back. The words of Isaiah chapter 2. And now I'm really concluding. Said, in the end of days, the mountain of the house of God will be set at the head of mountains and uplifted above all hills, and all the nations will stream to it. And many peoples will come and say, let us ascend to the mountain of God, to the house of the God of Jacob, and they will teach us his ways, and we will go in his paths. Because from Zion comes forth teaching, and the word of God from Jerusalem. That message, bring them all in, all the nations streaming. Bring in the sheaves on Sukkot. Chag Sameach to everyone.